Alright, in this video we'll take a close look at the various versions and iterations of the GEC KT88. This tube needs no introduction. If you're into tube amps, you probably already know the legendary status of this tube. It's often hailed as the holy grail or king of power tubes because of its high power and low distortion, which translates to exceptional sound quality. In addition, these tubes are known for their reliability and durability overall. New old stock and new in-box pairs or quads of these tubes command premium prices, and even some well-used tubes with burned getters can fetch high prices. And it's not just seller's hype. Online sales history confirms that audiophiles are willing to invest in these tubes for their sound quality and reliability. GEC is known to have tested batches of these tubes for up to 1,000 hours or more before shipping, ensuring consistent quality and reliability. These tubes can reportedly last up to 10,000 hours or more, far exceeding the typical 2,000 to 5,000 hour lifespan of most power tubes. This longevity, along with their sonic qualities, ensures that these vintage tubes remain as desirable as ever in hi-fi amps, guitar amps, and even some high-end headphone amps. After completing my A/B project with the 6550 tubes, I turned my attention to the KT88. I love tube rolling and testing different tubes in my amps to find the best sound on my system. My McIntosh MI75 monoblocks can readily accept both the 6550 and the KT88 tubes. Having explored all the 6550s, the KT88 was the obvious next step. Plus, I recently came across a fascinating time capsule of a listing on eBay of an original new in-box McIntosh MC75 from the 60s, which shows that McIntosh originally shipped MC75s with Genalex or GEC KT88 tubes, and that got me really curious as well to see how the GEC KT88 stacks up against the 6550s in my setup, and I can't wait to share what I find. For those unfamiliar with my audiophile journey, it has been all about trying out various vintage speakers, receivers, amplifiers, and tubes in pursuit of my endgame system. The KT88 is one of the last steps towards the culmination of my journey, as I believe I'm pretty much done putting together my endgame system. After extensive research, I believe I've gathered most of the KT88 versions to showcase here today. But first, let's clear up the branding and labeling of these tubes. The GEC KT88 was marketed under various names such as Genalex, Gold Lion, IEC Mullard, etc. There was also a military variant labeled CV5220, and no matter the label, whether it's Genalex Blue Label or Red Label or Gold Lion or Gold Monarch, they're all essentially the GEC KT88 tubes manufactured by MOV, the Marconi Osram Valve Company, a GEC subsidiary. The reason these tubes were marketed as Genalex and other labels, especially in the United States, is because GEC in this case stands for General Electric Company from UK. They wanted to differentiate themselves from the other General Electric Company from the United States, GE. They didn't want any confusion. They didn't want people to think that a GEC tube is a GE product because, as you know, GE also manufactured tubes. Therefore, GEC decided to have a completely different name and label for the US market, which is smart. It's good marketing. So that's how we get the Genalex label, and then it made no difference whether it's a blue label or red label or whether it was called something else. I've come across comments where people claim that the Genalex tube is an audiophile tube because it's a red label or it's a Gold Monarch or Gold Lion, but as far as I can tell from my research, that does not appear to be the case. What is apparent, however, is that GEC MOV spent a lot of time fine-tuning and perfecting the quality control, production, and testing of these tubes. It's not like they were producing lower quality batches and higher quality batches. It was the same KT88s coming out of the MOV factory with different labels slapped on it. And that's why today you'll find that most of the GEC tubes, regardless of the label, will command high prices and perform at similarly high levels. With that said, let's get to it. When I was looking at all the different versions of the GEC KT88, I tried to figure out the best way to categorize them, like I did with the Tungsol 6550 tube. With the 6550, I was able to break it down into versions like 1.1, 1.2, etc. based on the changes in the plate and the getters. But with the KT88, I realized the simplest and the most straightforward way would be to categorize these tubes by decades. So that's what we'll do here. We'll look at the tubes by decades, starting with the 50s. GEC introduced the KT88 in 1956, shortly after Tungsol introduced the 6550 tube. While Tungsol was working on their big tube, the 6550, GEC was working on their version of a big tube, the KT88. GEC already had their popular KT66 tube in production for a number of years by that time, and what they essentially did was they took the KT66 tube and made a bigger, badder version of this tube in the form of the KT88. It had similar structure of the early KT66 with the curved bakelite base and the ST-style Coke bottle glass envelope. This was the first version of the KT88 tube, launched in 1956. This was a top getter tube with two cup or disc getters on the top. This very first version of the tube remained in production for a very short time because apparently GEC quickly realized that the curved base and the KT66 style glass envelope was not very conducive to the performance and durability of the bigger KT88 tube. The first change was made just a few months after the launch in 1957 when they replaced the curved bakelite base with a round metal collar base. This was the same exact tube from the launch with the two top getters. The only change was the new base with the metal collar. The next change to this tube was also implemented within just a few months of the previous change, again in 1957, when they changed the glass envelope from the SD Coke bottle style to a taller barrel-style glass envelope. Both of these very early changes are the most recognizable features of the KT88 tube today because there were no additional changes made to the external body of this tube for decades to come. And don't worry about keeping track of all the changes I mention as we go along, because I will summarize all the changes towards the end with more pictures with date codes as evidence and a nice little chart. The first two versions of the KT88 with the curved bakelite base and the metal collar base were very short-lived. Therefore today they have become extremely rare to find and have pretty much become a collector's item. But the third tube here was in production all the way up until 1960. So this tube was in production for a good 3 to 4 years. So singles and matched pairs of these tubes do pop up from time to time, but are obviously very expensive. One such pair did pop up locally, so I was able to acquire it, and I have it here to show you. I got very lucky with this particular pair. I'll show you one of the tubes here. At a first glance, I thought this box was a reprint because it's in such a good condition, but to my surprise, it turned out to be an original box. This just happens to be a really well-kept pair from 1959, which is like new in box. So let's unbox it and see what this tube would have looked like fresh out of the factory back in 1959. So here's the box. As you can see, it's in such a great shape. It's the original box. It says KT88 on the top, and here's the unboxing. You can see it has this cardboard sleeve holder inside the box so that the tube is well protected. This side is the top of the tube and here's the bottom. So you open it like that and you pull the tube out. I put a little base down here to stand it up, and that didn't come with the tube obviously, but here it is. So this is a 1959 tube, a very early tube. Technically, it's the third iteration, but it's the first one that looks like a typical GEC KT88 tube. These are also very hard to find and expensive, as I mentioned. This is what the box looks like. I put my own sticker inside with the test results so I can keep track of it. I don't want to put any stickers on the box, obviously. And as you can see, this is clearly a GEC KT88 tube as we recognize it today. Same external structure, the same barrel-style glass envelope that's been the hallmark of the KT88 tube for almost 70 years now. Obviously, the big difference compared to all the future versions is that this tube is missing the side getters. The very early versions of this tube from the 50s have getters up on the top, so the 50s tube is a top getter only tube. That's the best way to identify the 50s tube. There are no side getters. The box is this white and navy blue box, and it has this bluish oval label with GEC written on it, and on the bottom here, if you can read it, probably not on the camera, it says Made in England, and on the other side it has a date code. The date codes on GEC KT88s are fairly straightforward, but let's take a moment here to go over the GEC date codes, and then we can come back and take a look at the tube again. GEC date codes are pretty straightforward, and we will focus specifically on the date codes pertaining to the KT88 tube. One year to note in particular is the year 1968, because there is pre-68 date codes and post-68 date codes. And 1968, interestingly, also shows up later on as an anomaly when we'll discuss the changes with the 60s tube, but that's for later. As far as the date codes go, prior to 1968, GEC was using alphabetic date codes, and after 1968, they switched to numeric date codes. The alphabetic date codes looked like this, and the numeric date codes looked like this. They usually had a rectangle, and within the rectangle, it would say KT88, and under the KT88, you would find the date code. The two-letter alphabetic date code was a year and month combination, where the first letter denoted the year and the second letter denoted the month of production, followed by the letter Z, which is a reference to the Hammersmith factory in London where the tubes were produced. The 4-digit numeric date code was a year and week combination, where the first 2 digits denoted the year and the last 2 digits denoted the week of production, and again followed by the Z. Obviously, the numeric date code is very straightforward, but we need a reference chart for the alphabetic date code. So here's the reference chart for GEC alpha years. Remember that GEC was already producing other tubes before the KT88, so they already had the system of date code in place before the KT88, and I've only included the years here applicable to the KT88. GEC launched KT88 in the year 1956, which corresponds to the letter M. So that would have been the first year for the KT88s. And as you can guess, when they ran out of all the alphabets in 1968 with the letter Z, they decided to switch the date codes to the numeric system we see on the right here, and that's the reason 1968 is a pivotal year. And one thing to note here with the years is that they deliberately skipped the letter O. So we jump from M, N directly to P and skip the letter O. When it comes to months, That's fairly straightforward, starting with A for January through M for December. One thing to note with the months is that they skip the letter I for months. So we jump from H to J and skip the letter I. My guess is that they wanted to skip anything that looked like a 0 or a 1 to avoid any confusion. So they skipped the letter O for the years and the letter I for the months. So if we were to decipher the date code we see here in this example, QB, that would translate to Q, which is 1959, and the B is February. So a tube with a code QB would be a February 1959 tube. Moving over to the right, the numeric date code is very straightforward, of course. The first two digits represent the years, which can range from anything between 69, the first year with numeric date codes, to about 86, the last year of production. The last two digits can be anything from 01 to 52, representing the 52 weeks of the year. So if you were to decipher the date code in this example, 7305, it would be 1973-05. So that would be the 5th week of 1973. So that would be a late Jan, early Feb tube from 1973. Now that we know the date codes in and out, let's go look at my tube again. Here's a rectangle with KT88 and the date code here is QM and there's the Z. QM would translate to 1959 December. So this is a late 1959 tube and what a beautiful tube. It just looks so nice. It reminds me of the Tungsol 1.1 black plate top getter tube. Something about the older top getter tubes, they just tend to sound best on my system. I don't know whether this tube will sound better than the rest, but I'm guessing it may based on my experience with the Tungsols. And that may be because my system is mostly vintage. I don't know. Anyway, let me show you the top getters here. And there you can see one right here and one right there. Those are the two disc or cup getters, and as I mentioned earlier, the best way to identify the 50s tube is that they don't have the side getters. They are a top getters only tube. Now I want to show you one more tube from the same period in contrast in terms of condition. This tube is part of another used pair I had purchased that was testing well. It's a Genalex label tube and it comes in this box which is quite deteriorated and has a lot of wear, but at least the tube doesn't suffer from the same fate. My guess is the boxes were most likely put away somewhere and neglected, while the tubes most likely sat on an amplifier somewhere. Anyway, if you look at the date code here, it says PF followed by a 4 instead of a Z. The PF translates to June 1958, and there's no definite explanation for the number 4 in place of the Z. This number appears on earlier tubes from before 1959 and is believed to represent some sort of internal batch number and not an indication of any plant or factory. So anyway, this is another example of this early top getter tube. Let me put this away here and we can move on to the 60s tube. So this here in front of us is the next version of the GEC KT88 tube. Let's go ahead and unbox it. Here you can see that the inner packaging has changed from that cardboard pocket type enclosure to this roll sheet of perforated cardboard. Let me unwrap this and put it away. So here's the box and here's the 60s tube. We see the black and teal label here, very recognizable, very common on the GEC KT88 tubes. Now let's look at the date code here, and the date code says KT88 7345. And if you recall, the date code switched to this 4-digit numeric date code after 1968. So this 7345 indicates that this tube is a 1973 tube. So why am I calling this a 60s tube? Well, the simple reason for that is this particular version of the tube with 3 halo getters, one on top and one on each side, was introduced in the early 60s and it remained unchanged all the way up until mid 70s, except for one anomaly. Let's take a closer look at the 60s tube. As you can recall, the top getter 50s tube was in production up until 1960. Around 1961, we get to see a major change to the tube in terms of the getters. GEC replaced the top 2 getters from the 50s with a triple halo design, 1 halo getter on the top and 1 halo getter on each side of the plate. And this triple halo design, introduced in 1961, remained unchanged all the way until 1975. So this 60s design essentially remained unchanged for almost 15 years, with the exception of one anomaly. Remember 1968? Well, for some reason, GEC made one change to the top getter of this tube in 1968. The halo getter on top was replaced with a D getter in 1968. But what's perplexing is that after having halo getter on top for 7 years, from 1961 through 1967, they introduced the D getter on top in 1968. But for whatever reason, they only retained this top D getter design for about less than a year and switched it right back to halo getter by the end of 1968. So we had top halo getter from 1961 to 1967, then for about a year we had the top D getter in 1968, and then we have the top halo getter again from 1969 to about 1975. So what prompted GEC to change the top getter from halo to a D getter in 1968 and switch it right back to halo getter again within a year? I don't know. Did they switch to D-getter because it was better than the halo getter? If so, then why did they switch it right back to halo again? Did they do it because it aligned with the change in the date codes from alpha codes to numeric codes? Unlikely, but who knows? And does it make this D-getter tube more desirable or less desirable? I mean, it may be more desirable from a collector's perspective because of its short run, but does it actually sound better than the halo getter tube? I don't know. I guess I'll find out. I was just able to gather all of this from my own research, and I was unable to find any additional information on this particular change. If you happen to have any additional insight into why this was done, then please comment and enlighten us. In any case, the 60s design with the triple halo getter had the longest run from 1961 all the way up to 1975, except for that very short run of D-getters, of course. I will provide additional evidence with pictures and summarize all of these changes towards the end, but I do have a couple more tubes to show you here. This tube here with this worn out label is a 60s tube with the same exact design as this 1973 tube. Let's look at the date code to determine the exact year of this tube. And the date code is YK. And if you refer to the chart, we can see that this is an October 1967 tube, so 1 year before 1968. Now let's compare this 1967 tube with the 1973 tube. And you can see here, side by side, that there is literally no difference between these tubes. They have the black plates, the matte black, rough black plates, and the triple halo structure. The internal structure here suggests that there is no difference between these tubes. They are identical.
Identical.
Now let me show you the anomaly from the 60s. This tube has a date code of ZD, which translates to April 1968. And if you recall, the previous tube was YK, which is an October 67 tube. So this April 1968 tube was produced just 6 months after the YK tube I showed you earlier. And you can clearly see here that this tube has a D-getter on the top instead of the halo getter found on the tube just 6 months prior. And comparing it again with the 73 tube, we can see here that they look exactly the same except for the D-getter on the 68 tube. Hence, I'm categorizing the 60s tube as a tube from 1961 to 1975. Let me put this away here, and that pretty much covers all the 60s tube. As far as the box is concerned, the 60s tube came primarily in this blue GEC box, which is mostly unchanged from the 50s, and we have this black and teal label, of course, that can also help with identifying the 60s tube. With that said, let's wrap up the 60s tube and move on to the 70s tube. As we have seen, the 60s tube was in production from 1961 to about 1975. In 1976, we get to see a different version of this tube in terms of both external packaging as well as some minor changes to the tube itself. Let me show you. Here's a box of 70s tube, and let's unbox it. It's very similar to 60s box and packaging, but obviously we have a new color scheme for the 70s box. Let me pull this tube out and put the box away, and here's the 70s tube. And the first thing we notice is the new label. Older labels were these oval shaped labels with rounded corners. The new label is more boxy with straighter lines, and of course we have a whole new color scheme with the label. It's a yellow creamish label with blue lettering, and it says Made in England by the MOV Company Limited. Let's check the date code, and this tube is from 1977. So now, why am I calling this tube a 70s tube but not the tube from 1973 a 70s tube? It's just a 4-year difference between these tubes. Did the tube really change apart from the labeling? Well, I was looking at the internal structure of these tubes to determine what, if anything, has changed, and I do notice a couple of changes in this tube, along with the labeling. And I guess I've noticed it's fair to say that whenever GEC changed the label design or color scheme of the box, that was usually followed with some changes on the tube as well. So what changes did I notice in this tube? Well, the changes are in the top part of the tube. I would like to draw your attention to the black metal part on the top. I believe it's called the top shield or the radiator shield. It went from a straight rectangular cut and straight edges to this diagonal cut and diagonal corner on one side. In addition, it also looks like the top mica plate position and the getter rod were shortened a little bit, which results in a slightly shorter gloss envelope on the top, as you can see here. And I'm not sure how any of these changes would affect the sound or performance of the tube, but I'm sure they made these changes for a reason. I'll have to A/B these tubes, listen to them, and compare them to the 60s tube to determine if there's any sound differences between these tubes. I'm guessing there are going to be differences, but to what degree, we'll see. But other than that, the tube is very similar to the 60s tube. The plates look the same with the matte black, rough black finish, and of course it's got the triple halo getter setup, so no change there to the getter either. The only difference with the 60s tube is that it's got a diagonal top radiator shield and it's a slightly shorter tube. So that's pretty much it. That's the 70s tube. Let me put that away and let's move on to the 80s tube. The 70s tube was in production for about 5 years until it was replaced with the 80s tube in 1981. Let's take a closer look at the 80s tube. And finally, we've made it to the 80s tube with this red and black box here. In addition to these bold colors for the box, GEC officially changed the branding of their tubes from GEC to Gold Lion. Let's go ahead and unbox this tube. The internal packaging is similar to the tubes from 60s and 70s, but in the 80s, the tube also comes with this test result sheet. We'll get to the tube in a second. Let's take a look at this test report first. It says tube type KT88, talks about quality standards in testing. Tubes have passed a life test of 1,000 hours without failure. These tests are carried out by an independent testing laboratory. The tube packed with this report is from a production with the following measured characteristics. And these look like handwritten values, but it's not handwritten, it's just printed that way. It's a report of their testing parameters, and they're generalizing here and saying that the tube in the box has passed because it tested within these parameters defined for the batch of these tubes. As you can see, they've listed the minimum, mean, and maximum values here. Anyway, that's pretty cool. Let me put that away. Alright, so here's the 80s tube, and we get the Gold Lion label, which was actually introduced a year prior with the 70s tube, but I will talk about that a little later. And just a fair warning here, the 80s tubes are going to be a bit wonky as we go along. Let's see, the date code here is 8133, so 33rd week of 1981. We no longer have the date code with the rectangle as seen on previous tubes. Instead, it's just listed here under the label. The big change we see here is in the plates. As you can see, the 70s tube, in fact, going back to the 50s through 60s and into the 70s, we had the matte black plate with the rough sort of surface, and you can see these micro scratches and things like that on the plate surface. But in the 80s, we have transitioned to this very smooth, shiny black plate, which I'm sure will have some impact on the sound, which I will find out in my AB. But as far as the top shield is concerned, it is identical to the 70s tube. So they've retained the diagonal top shield from the 70s tube on the top, as you can see here, but the plate surface has changed, as I mentioned, from the matte finish to the shiny finish. Now let me take a moment to talk about the timing of the introduction of new labels and changes I have observed for the GEC tubes. What I have observed is that generally speaking, a label change with these tubes was accompanied with changes to the internal structure of the tube. For example, the blue and teal logo for the 60s tube was accompanied with a triple halo change, and the yellow label for the 70s tube was accompanied with the diagonal top shield change, and the Gold Lion for the 80s tube was accompanied with the shiny black plate change. However, I've noticed that the timing and introduction of the label always preceded the change in the tubes themselves by a few weeks or months. For example, the yellow label and boxes were introduced and applied to the end of run 60s tube around mid-70s in 1975 or so, right before the yellow theme and yellow label became a recognizable feature of the 70s tube. So you may come across a few 60s design tubes from late 1975 or so with yellow labels and yellow boxes. Similarly, the Gold Lion label was introduced almost a year before we got the shiny plates of the 80s. So we can see quite a few late 70s tubes with matte plates that have the Gold Lion label. So the bottom line here is the transition to new labels and design was piecemeal. It happened in a phased manner, where they first introduced the label and box changes, and then introduce the tube changes a few weeks to months after the label changes. That's just something to keep in mind, that we can't always just go by labels or boxes. Labels and boxes can be generalized for the time period, but it's always best to study and understand the internal plate structure to identify the tube properly, especially with the Gold Lion tubes in the 80s. As I mentioned earlier, things are about to get a little crazy as we go through the 80s. First, we have the Gold Lions from late 70s. These are the late 70s tubes with Gold Lion label, but with matte black plates. Then we have the tube from the 80s that I showed you, which has the Gold Lion label with the shiny black plates. Now let me show you another version of the 80s tube that's from 1984. As you can see, it's a Gold Lion tube, and let's compare it to the previous tube. This tube on the right is dated 8133, and the tube on the left is 8446. So it's an 84 tube on the left and an 81 tube on the right, and when you look at them, they look identical. They both have the shiny plates, the diagonal radiator shield on the top, and the two side getters. However, if you look at the top getters, the tube on the left has two getters on the top. You see that? There's one, there's the other one. Again, I'm not sure why they added two getters to this tube, which makes this tube a quadruple halo getter tube, one on each side of the plate and two on the top, versus this one, which is a regular triple halo getter tube with just one getter up here on the top. So we see this change happen in 1984, just 3 years after the introduction of the shiny black plates in 1981. But here's the kicker. They switched right back to the matte plates in 1985. Go figure. Here's a picture of tubes dated 8552, so late 85 tubes, and we can see that we still have the two halo getters on the top, but they have switched back to the matte black plates again. So as you can see, 80s tubes are all over the place. But I guess we know that by late 70s, early 80s, tubes were all but getting abandoned. It was the time for solid state. All the tube manufacturers were going out of business, closing shop, and selling their equipment. And tube production was moving to Eastern Europe, Russia, and China. And that's what we see here. That applies to GEC as well. That's why we see all this weirdness in the 80s. But the 80s Gold Lion tube remains very popular and in high demand. People love them and swear by them, but I guess I'll find out myself when I A/B these with the older tubes. I wonder if people just like the 80s tubes because of the cool Gold Lion label, or do these actually sound better than the 70s, 60s, or the 50s tube? I guess I'll find out and report back to you. The last of the original GEC KT88 or the Gold Lion KT88 is reported to have been produced around 1986 or 1987 when the production ended. I've not been able to find a definitive answer to that. The latest tube I have come across was this 8650 tube from December of 1986. Were these produced into 87 and even 88? I don't know. If you have any knowledge about this, or if you have any tubes in your possession, or if you've seen these tubes dated past 86, then please do let us know in the comments. And it's also speculated that the last couple of years or so of the Gold Lion KT88 tubes were produced in China. I went digging to find more information about that speculation, and I came across a couple of things. First, in the depths of audio forums, I found this picture of a letter posted by user. It seems to be a typewritten letter from the tube manufacturer MOV themselves, and it seems to be in response to a question about their tubes being manufactured in China. It's dated July 23, 1986, and it reads, "Dear Sir, thank you for your letter on the KT88. The life of a KT88 will depend on many factors. The length of time the amp is used daily, the ambient temperature of the room in which the tube is used, the proximity to other hot devices, and as you mentioned, the current in the tube all affect life. Generally, the cooler a tube runs, the longer it lives, although we know of instances where the KT88 has lived for 10,000 hours running cherry red. We in fact used to have the tubes running red hot on our aging racks before we sent them out to stabilize characteristics. It would be to your benefit to keep your tubes as cool as possible. Any reduction of quiescent current will help the situation. At 10 watts RMS output, you should have a very long life from the KT88. One factor that can damage the life of a tube is very low heater volts, as it is always better to run the cathode slightly hot rather than slightly cold. The latter can cause contamination of the cathode surface. We trust these few comments have been a help and would remind you that we no longer manufacture the tube in Hammersmith, but in fact have it made in China up to Gold Lion standard and checked in our factory. Yours faithfully," there's a signature there, "Product Sales Manager." Well, without any speculations or having to read in between the lines, we can conclude for sure that the Gold Lion KT88s, at least as of July 1986, and who knows how much farther back it went, were in fact produced in China. Couple of questions I had were around where he says, "We in fact used to have the tubes running red hot on our aging racks before we sent them out." What does he mean by used to? Does that mean they didn't do that anymore as of 1986? I don't know. Then there is that we have them made in China up to Gold Lion standard and checked in our factory. Which factory is he referring to? The Chinese factory, or did they have them shipped from China to UK and inspected them in UK before they were shipped out to consumers? Because the tubes were still labeled made in England as of 1986. So anyway, this letter was one piece of evidence I found as far as tubes being manufactured in China is concerned. The second thing, which is a completely different story, is this particular set of Gold Lion KT88 tubes. I came across this Italian website that is selling a pair of these very different looking Gold Lion KT88 tubes for 900 euros. As you can see, these tubes are quite boxy and shorter compared to the regular GECs. In addition, these tubes have 3 holes in the plate, which none of the GECs had. Is this even a genuine GEC tube? My initial research suggests otherwise. As far as the site is concerned, this looks like a reputable site, and they're also selling other NOS tubes, including the original Gold Lion KT8 tubes, and they seem to have priced both of these sets similarly. So I got curious and really wanted to try these tubes. I was trying to determine if what GEC produced in China were these specific set of KT88 tubes with a very different design compared to the previous KT88s. So what did I do? I got these tubes, and I have one of these tubes to show you here. As you can see, this tube has a Gold Lion, a date code. It says KT88, but it doesn't say made in England, so at least they're being honest about it. It has 3 holes in the plate, which is not typical of a GEC KT88. The date code on this tube is 8732. It's a triple halo design, but it's quite different from a regular GEC KT88 tube. The entire internal plate structure is different. In fact, this tube looks more like the Chinese 6550 tube than a KT88 tube. It's most likely a Chinese 6550 in a bigger glass envelope. Also, this certainly does not look like like a tube MOV would have sanctioned. Upon further research, I was able to determine that this is not a GEC KT88 at all. If you recall the picture of the tubes from late 1986, well after the confirmation from the sales manager from MOV in July of 86 that their tubes were being made in China, we can see that the late 1986 tube, even though it was being produced in China, still looked very much like a typical GEC KT88. It's got the typical gloss envelope, gold lion label, and the solid matte black plate. Whereas this particular tube looks exactly like the tubes found in this picture of a Shuguang KT88 tubes from late 80s, early 90s. So we can conclude that this tube is a Chinese Shuguang tube and not a GEC KT88 tube. As you can see here, this tube is nothing like the original KT88. The getters themselves, the halo getters, they're different sizes. This getter here is thicker and smaller in diameter. These are wider in diameter and thinner, so not the same at all. The top shield is completely different, and this tube is much shorter as well. But it was worth it to try this tube out and see what it sounds like, and to show it to all of you that I didn't leave any stone unturned in terms of finding and acquiring different versions of the KT88 tubes. Maybe this was one of the first copycat tubes to come out of China. Maybe after GEC completely shut down and stopped production of their KT88s, the Chinese saw an opportunity to produce a similar looking tube, but they didn't have the rights or access to the GEC design and tooling, and this was their best attempt at filling a hole in the market. Who knows? I was actually very curious, and I tried and listened to these tubes on my MI75 amps right away when I received them. I actually got to compare these tubes to a set of valve art KT88 tubes, also Chinese, and I can report here that even the fake Chinese Gold Lion sounded much better than the Chinese non-Gold Lion KT88s. There's a hierarchy and pedigree within the Chinese tubes as well. Who knew? Maybe these are collectible. Maybe that's why the website has priced them the way they have. I don't know. Speaking of another KT88 that's not like the original KT88, to nobody's surprise, is the current production Genalex Gold Lion KT88 made by New Sensor. The glass envelope is similar to the original KT88, but it looks nothing like the GEC KT88s when we look closely at the internal structure of the tube. The internal structure, ironically, is closer to that of Shuguang KT88 tube. So if you've only experienced these new Gold Lion KT88s, then I'm sorry to say, but you really haven't experienced the original KT88. But of course, in terms of new tubes and current production options, this is a good choice. People seem to like them, especially in newer amps. But if you have vintage amps, vintage tubes tend to be a better match in my experience. And depending on the tube, depending on your amp, if you know the power handling, if you know the volts at the plates, the plate dissipation, you may be able to pair up some NOS tubes with newer amps, especially the GEC KT88, as it is a quite robust tube and should work in most newer amps. I don't have newer tube amps, and I haven't tried too many of the current gen tubes. I love my vintage amps, and they tend to pair really well with the vintage tubes. I try new tubes once in a while, and at least on my system, on my gear, the synergy is just not there. In my system, pretty much everything in the chain is vintage, except for the source. So maybe that's why NOS tubes just sound better on my system. So there you have it. I've pretty much covered all the KT88s, all the different versions of the KT88 tube to the best of my knowledge. Let me now summarize all the changes in a chart with additional pictures with date codes as promised. If you're with me so far and you're able to catch everything, then that's great. So far, I was describing all the tubes and the changes in a cruise mode. Now we'll do the same in sports mode. Hope you get to enjoy it as much as I did. Let's start with the chart. As you know, I've categorized the GEC KT88 by decades. So we have decades in the first column here, followed by the box column, where you'll see the general box color or theme that went with the decade, followed by the label column, again, generalized by the decade, followed by the getters column that details the getter configuration, followed by the change column that details the changes we observed for that decade, followed by the first observed and last observed columns for the years that correspond to the changes. Having said that, let's begin with the 50s tube. This tube was in production for about 5 years and saw a couple of changes very early on. As we know, GEC launched the KT88 in 1956, and this 50s version was in production for about 5 years until 1960. Tubes from the 50s came in the typical blue and white box with GEC or Genalex labels. As far as the getters are concerned, the 50s tube is distinguished as being the top getter only tube. There were no side getters on this tube. This tube just had 2 cup or disc getters on the top. As far as the changes are concerned, that's not applicable to this particular tube, as this was the very first launch version of the tube. It had the curved bakelite base and the SD Coke bottle type glass envelope. First observed at launch in 1956 and was also last observed in 1956, as this design was fairly short-lived. Here's an example of this very early tube with dates. This tube is dated MH, which translates to August of 1956. As you can see, it has the curved bakelite base with the SD type Coke bottle glass envelope. This launch version of the 50s tube was in production for less than a year, as this early version was only produced for a few months before the tube saw some changes. The first change made to this tube was the introduction of the round metal collar base. Just a call out here, when I say change, what qualifies as a change to be listed in this column here is a change to the tube itself. That would include any change to the getter, shape, or position, changes to the plate, or in other words, any change to the internal structure or the body of the tube. Any changes to the tube box or label are considered cosmetic and are therefore not included in this column. Going back to the change, the round metal collar base was introduced in early 1957, as you can see evidenced on this tube here, which has the date code of NA, which translates to January 1957. When we compare this tube with the previous tube with the curved bakelite base, which had the date code of MH, which is August of 1956, just within 4 months of that August 1956 tube, we see this change happen with the Jan 1957 tube. And this particular design with the metal collar base and the ST Coke bottle glass envelope was also short-lived, as we see the next change happen very quickly as well. And that was the Coke bottle glass envelope to the barrel style glass envelope change, which also happened in the year 1957, as evidenced by this tube here, which has the new barrel style glass envelope along with the metal collar base. This tube has a date code of NG, which is a little hard to tell here, but that translates to July of 1957. So within 6 months of the previous change, we see the change for the glass envelope, and as I had mentioned earlier, this was the formative design of the KT88 tube as far as the base and the glass envelope is concerned. This external design did not change again throughout the production life cycle of this tube. This last version of the 50s tube was introduced in 1957 and saw no further changes until 1961. So this tube was in production for about 4 years, from 1957 to 1960. We just saw the tube from 1957, and we've also seen a couple of my tubes earlier in the video dating from 1958 and 1959. And here's an example from 1960. As you can see the RC label, which makes this a March 1960 tube, and as you can see, nothing has changed since 1957. It's got the metal collar base, the barrel glass envelope, and the 2 cup getters on the top. 1960 was the last year of the 50s top getter tube. The next major change we see to this tube ushers us into the 60s era, as evidenced in this picture here of an SE or May 1961 tube. In contrast to all other tubes on the left, we can clearly see that the 1961 tube has the side getters, while all previous tubes were top getter tubes. Let's now look at the 60s tube. This tube was in production for the longest without any major changes, from 1961 all the way up to 1975, with one exception for the year 1968. These tubes also, generally speaking, came in the similar blue and white GEC boxes. The label was the definitive black and teal rectangle with rounded corners, which remained unchanged during the entire production run of the 60s tube. As far as the getters are concerned, this was a triple getter tube, 1 getter on the top and 1 getter on each side of the plate. The first major change to the GEC KT88 happened in 1961, as I just showed you with the SE tube, where we see the change from the dual top getter to a triple halo getter setup. This design remained in production all the way up until 1967, so for about 7 years. Here's the SE tube again from 1961, and I have a couple of more examples with tubes dated TF and VJ, which translates to June 1962 and September 1964 respectively. Earlier in the video, I showed you my triple halo tube from 1967 dated YK, which was an October 1967 tube. And here's another example of a December 1967 tube dated YM. And we can clearly see here that from the introduction of the triple halo getters in 1961 all the way to the end of year December 1967, we do not see any change. They're all triple halo getter tubes with 1 halo getter on the top and 1 on each side of the plate. We see the next change to this tube in the year 1968, where the top halo getter is replaced with a D getter, and this change was short-lived and was only found during the year 1968. Here's an example of a tube from March 1968 with a D getter on the top. Within just 3 months after the December 1967 tube we saw earlier, we have gone from the top halo getter to the top D getter, and we already saw my tube labeled ZD earlier in the video, which was an April 1968 tube with the top D getter. And how do we know the top D getter change only applied to the year 1968? Well, here's a picture of a tube with a ZM date code, which is December of 1968, and you can clearly see that we're back to the halo getter up on the top by the end of 1968. We can see top halo getter in December 1967 and back again in December 1968, with a couple of examples of D getters in between. I'm not exactly sure how many months in 1968 had the tubes with top D getters. All we can derive here is that the top D getter was introduced sometime early in 1968 and was replaced replaced again with the halo getter by the end of 1968. For that reason, I've categorized the top D getter tube as a 1968 tube. The next change obviously is the top D getter to the halo getter change, along with the alphabetic to numeric date code change in the year 1969. And with this change, we're back to the early 60s design again with the triple halo structure, and similarly this time around, the tube remains unchanged for almost 7 years from 1969 to all the way up until 1975. We can clearly see both the top halo getter and the numeric date code implementation with this set of early 69 tubes dated 6918. In addition to this very early 69 tube, we can also see more examples of this tube here with this late 69 tube with the top halo and this early 70s tube with triple halo. I already showed you my 73 tube, which I referred to as a 60s tube for this reason. If you pick an early 60s tube and compare it to an early 70s tube, you'll find no difference. Hence, in addition to tubes from 60s, I'm categorizing the early to mid 70s tubes also as 60s tubes for all intents and purposes. This triple halo getter tube introduced in 1961 had the longest run of almost 15 years. We see the next change to this tube happen in 1976. And with that, we get into the 70s tube. This tube was introduced in 1976 and was in production for about 5 years until 1980. The 70s tube saw a major change to the box and the label and minor changes to the tube itself. In a departure from the long-running blue and white theme for the boxes, a new yellow and blue color scheme was introduced for the boxes, along with the less rounded yellow and blue rectangular label. There was no change to the getters. The 70s tube had the same triple halo getter setup from the 60s. There were just a couple of minor changes with this 70s tube. First was the change in the top radiator shield, where it was changed from a straight rectangular shield to a shield with a diagonal cut. Along with this change, the height of the top getter rod was reduced and the mica plate adjusted accordingly, which resulted in a slightly shorter tube up top. These changes were introduced in 1976 and remained unchanged till the very end throughout the production run of both the 70s tube and the 80s tube. We can see these changes clearly in this set of tubes from mid-70s. We have a 1975 tube on the left, and the two tubes on the right are from 1976. We can see the change in the top shield from the straight corner to a diagonal corner. And it may be a little hard to tell, but the top part of the glass envelope is slightly shorter on the 76 tubes compared to the 75 tube. This tube remained unchanged from 1975 all the way up until early 1981. One thing to note here is that the gold lion label was introduced in late 1979, so you will also find a few of these late 70s tubes with the gold lion label, which is usually associated with the 80s tube. As I mentioned earlier, label changes were implemented by GEC before the changes to the tube itself, so a label change does not mean a change to the tube. In this case, you will find that some late 70s, 1979, and even some very early 1980 tubes have the gold lion label, but it's really the 70s tube with the matte black plate. The transition to the shiny black plate happened in the early 80s. Which brings us to the 80s tube, which was introduced in 1981 and remained in production for about 6 or 7 years before the production of these legendary KT88 tubes ceased entirely. The 80s tube saw the introduction of and the rebranding to the bold black and red themed Gold Lion box. Even though the Gold Lion label was introduced towards the end of production of the 70s tube, it's mostly associated with the 80s tube. And as I had mentioned earlier in the video, as we get into the 80s, things start to get a little all over the place. As far as the getters are concerned, the 80s tube had a triple halo getter setup for about half of its production life, and then a quadruple halo getter setup with 2 getters on the top for second half of its production life. We see a major departure from the 70s tubes with the first change in 1981, where we see the matte black plates that date all the way back to the 50s replaced with these very smooth and shiny black plates. From 1981 to 1984, so for about 4 years, we see that the 80s tube had the triple halo getter setup. So it's very similar to the 70s tube with the triple halo setup and the diagonal top shield, with the obvious exception of the shiny black plates. As you can see the pair in this picture, the change to the shiny plate was implemented in early 1981. We have 2 tubes here that are 6 weeks apart. The one on the right is an 8106 tube, and the one on the left, it's a little faded, but it's an 8112 tube. When we look at the plates on these tubes, we see that the tube on the right with 8106 date code has a matte black plate, and just 6 weeks later, the tube on the left with 8112 date code has a shiny black plate. The next change we see in this tube is the implementation of the dual top getter in late 1984. which essentially makes this a quad halo getter tube. As we can see here with this tube dated 8426, it still has same structure as the tube introduced in 1981. It's got the shiny black plate, it's got the triple halo getter with a single halo getter on the top, and with the 8426 date code, this makes it middle of the year 1984 tube. However, I showed you my tube dated 8446. It had the dual halo getters on the top. So sometime in the second half of 1984, we get to see dual halo getters on the top. Here's a picture with three 1984 tubes next to each other. The one on the left is an 8421 tube, and you can clearly see that the 8421 tube has a single getter on the top that is wider in diameter compared to the two getters on the top for the 8437 tubes that are smaller in diameter compared to the 8421 tube. So sometime between 8421 and 8437, the single halo getter on the top was replaced with dual halo getters on the top. We see another change to this tube the following year in 1985, where we see the reversal on texture of the plates from shiny black plates to matte black plates. Don't ask me why. This is the last iteration of the GEC KT88 tube. Matte plates with quad halo getters and the diagonal top shield. Here's an early 85 tube, 8512, that appears to have shiny black plates, but by the time we get to late 85, 8552, we have matte black plates. So sometime in 1985, shiny plates were replaced with matte plates. There is no change to the dual getters on the top, so it's still a quad halo getter tube. The last batch of tubes I was able to find a picture of was this set of tubes with a very early 86 tube on the extreme left and a very late 86 tube on the extreme right. So that pretty much covers the entire year of 1986, and we can see that they both had matte plates and they still had the dual halo getters on the top. So it's fair to assume that the very last iteration of the GEC KT88 was a matte plate quad halo getter tube with diagonal top shield. The exact year and week of the last production batch of these tubes is unknown. However, it's widely believed to be 1986. If you have any knowledge about the last run of these tubes, then please do share in the comments. So that pretty much covers all the GEC KT88s. That's all the different versions of this tube to the best of my knowledge. When I first started looking into GEC, I thought the GEC KT88 was a fairly straightforward tube with very little variation. I thought there were only 2 or 3 different versions of this tube. I certainly thought the number of variations would be less than that of the Tungsol 6550, which had 5 different variations in its 20+ year run. Turns out, I was way off. The GEC KT88 has about 10 different variations in its 30+ year run. Some of these changes seem to be major, while others seem minor. As you can imagine, just researching and cataloging these tubes was difficult enough and took a long time, so actually finding and acquiring the various versions for listing purposes has been a daunting task. I've been collecting these tubes for over a year now for a sound A/B comparison, and it's been a very expensive endeavor. You know, for science. At least, that's what I told my wife. I had to liquidate most of my 6550 tubes to make way for the KT88s, and at one point I was looking up the merits of keeping both kidneys. Like, do we really need 2? Well, apparently I've been able to acquire quads of most of these tubes, and I'm currently engaged in listening and A/Bing these tubes on my system. I like to live with the tubes for some time and really get to know them before I pass my judgment. So I'll take my time with these tubes and post my findings on sound differences between these tubes sooner or later. I've broadly categorized these tubes by decades based on what I think are meaningful changes. So I'm really interested in hearing the differences between the tubes across the decades. For example, I'm sure the 50s tube will and should sound different from all others because it's a top getter tube, but how different will the triple halo sound? The triple halos from 60s compared to the triple halos from 70s and 80s? I don't know. Only time will tell, but it's all very exciting. When I did my sound A/B exercise with the 6550 tubes, the first gen Tungsol 6550 black plate with the triple D getters on the top turned out to be the best sounding tubes on my system. Now I'm really curious to find out which of the GECs will sound the best on my system, and then I'm really looking forward to pit the best of GECs against the best of Tungsols to see which tube is the king of all tubes on my system. That verdict remains to be seen or heard. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.